In the winter of 1940, in a secret compound near Harbin, China, a Chinese prisoner was dragged into a frozen courtyard. Japanese doctors stripped his arms bare and exposed them to temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. They sprayed water on his skin until ice crystals formed. Then they beat his frozen limbs with sticks until the flesh cracked open. This was not punishment. It was an experiment. The doctors were testing frostbite treatments for the Japanese army. The prisoner screamed until he lost consciousness. He died 3 days later from infection and shock. This was just one experiment among thousands conducted at Unit 731, Japan's most secret and most brutal military research facility during World War II. Between 1936 and 1945, over 10,000 people, mostly Chinese civilians, but also Russians, Koreans, and Mongols, were subjected to unimaginable torture in the name of science. They were infected with plague, typhoid, and cholera. They were dissected alive without anesthesia. They were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes burst. And when the war ended, Japan destroyed all evidence, and the world forgot. But history does not forgive silence. If this story shocks you, if it makes you question how far humanity can fall, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with others. Leave a comment telling us what you think, because remembering these crimes is the only way we can prevent them from happening again. Now, let me take you back to 1936, to the frozen plains of Manchuria, where one man's ambition turned medicine into murder. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Japanese military knew that the next war would be fought not only with bullets, but also with germs. Biological weapons could kill thousands without a single shot, and they were cheap, invisible, and terrifying. But to develop these weapons, Japan needed to test them on living human beings. Enter General Shirō Ishii, a brilliant and ruthless microbiologist who had studied at Kyoto Imperial University. Ishii was obsessed with biological warfare. He believed that Japan could dominate Asia by weaponizing disease. In 1936, with the full backing of Emperor Hirohito and the Imperial Japanese Army, Ishii was given command of a secret research facility in the Pingfong district of Harbin, a remote industrial city in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The facility was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But inside the Japanese military, it was known simply as Unit 731. The compound covered 6 square kilometers and included laboratories, barracks, crematoria, and a 3-story prison designed to hold over 400 prisoners at once. These prisoners were called maruta, which means logs in Japanese. To the staff of Unit 731, they were not human beings, they were raw material. Most of the maruta were Chinese civilians arrested by the Kimpeitai, Japan's secret police. They were accused of being spies, bandits, or anti-Japanese resistors. Many were innocent. Some were women. Some were children as young as 6 years old. Once inside Unit 731, no one ever came out alive. The experiments began almost immediately. Ishii and his team of over 3,000 doctors, scientists, and soldiers conducted research in bacteriology, virology, chemical warfare, and surgical trauma. But these were not ordinary experiments. They were designed to see how much pain the human body could endure, how quickly disease could kill, and whether biological weapons could be used on a mass scale. Prisoners were infected with bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and syphilis. Doctors would observe the progression of the disease without providing treatment. They recorded the exact moment when organs failed, when breathing stopped, when the body finally gave up. Then they would dissect the corpse while it was still warm to examine how the infection had spread. In many cases, prisoners were dissected while they were still alive. They were strapped to operating tables and cut open without anesthesia. Doctors wanted to see how the organs functioned in real time, unaffected by the chemicals used in anesthesia. Survivors of Unit 731 later testified that the screams of the Maruta could be heard throughout the compound, day and night. One of the most horrifying experiments involved freezing. Japanese soldiers fighting in Siberia and northern China suffered severe frostbite, and the army wanted to know how to treat it. So Unit 731 conducted tests by forcing prisoners to stand outside in sub-zero temperatures with their limbs exposed. Doctors would wait until the skin turned black, then thaw the limbs using various methods: hot water, fire, or simply letting them rot. Most prisoners died from infection or shock. Some had their limbs amputated while fully conscious. In another experiment, prisoners were locked inside pressure chambers. The air pressure was slowly increased or decreased to see how the body would react. Many prisoners' eyes burst from their sockets. Their eardrums exploded. Blood poured from their mouths and noses. Doctors took detailed notes. They did not intervene. These were not isolated incidents. They were standard procedure. Every day, dozens of prisoners were selected for experiments. Every day, new Maruta arrived to replace the dead. The facility operated like a factory, producing data for biological warfare at the cost of human lives. And the most chilling part? The Japanese government knew everything. High-ranking officials, including members of the imperial family, visited Unit 731 and praised Ishii's work. The experiments were not hidden, they were celebrated. Because in the twisted logic of war, science without morality was seen as strength. And that strength, they believed, would help Japan conquer the world. As the experiments at Unit 731 intensified, the scope of the atrocities expanded beyond the walls of the Harbin compound. Ishii and his team were not content with laboratory research. They wanted to test their biological weapons in the field, on real populations, to see how effective they could be in war. Between 1940 and 1942, Unit 731 conducted multiple biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities and villages. These attacks were among the first uses of biological weapons in modern warfare, and they resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. One of the earliest attacks took place in Ningbo, a coastal city in Zhejiang province, in October 1940. Japanese planes flew over the city and dropped ceramic bombs filled with fleas infected with bubonic plague. Within weeks, the city was hit by an outbreak. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from high fever, swollen lymph nodes, and black skin lesions. Over 500 people died in the first wave. The plague spread to nearby villages, and the death toll climbed into the thousands. A similar attack occurred in Changde, Hunan province, in November 1941. Japanese aircraft dropped bags of plague-infested fleas and grain contaminated with bacteria. The city was devastated. According to Chinese records, over 7,000 people died from plague and related diseases in the months following the attack. Survivors described scenes of horror, bodies piled in the streets, families quarantined in their homes, and entire neighborhoods abandoned. What made these attacks even more brutal was that Unit 731 sent research teams to the affected areas to observe the results. Japanese doctors disguised as medical aid workers entered the quarantine zones, took blood samples, recorded symptoms, and then left without providing treatment. They were not there to help. They were there to collect data. To Unit 731, the suffering of Chinese civilians was nothing more than a field experiment. But the biological attacks were not limited to plague. Unit 731 also tested anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. In some cases, they contaminated water supplies with bacteria.
In other cases, they distributed poisoned food to villages suspected of harboring anti-Japanese resistance fighters. The goal was always the same: to kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible, and to study the results. Back in Harbin, the experiments continued. Unit 731 had multiple subunits, each specializing in a different type of research. Unit EI 1644 in Nanjing focused on chemical weapons. Unit 100 in Changchun conducted biological warfare research on animals and crops. Unit 516 in Chichahar worked on poison gas production. Together, these facilities formed a network of death that stretched across Japanese-occupied China. One particularly disturbing program involved vivisection without anesthesia. Japanese doctors wanted to understand how diseases affected the human body in real time, so they infected prisoners with bacteria and then cut them open while they were still alive. Organs were removed, examined, and weighed. Blood samples were taken. The prisoners were conscious throughout the entire procedure, restrained only by leather straps. According to testimony from former Unit 731 staff, some prisoners begged to be killed before the operation began. Their pleas were ignored. Another horrifying experiment involved testing the limits of human survival. Prisoners were deprived of food and water for days, sometimes weeks, to see how long the body could endure. Others were subjected to extreme heat or cold. Some were exposed to radiation. Others were injected with animal blood to test compatibility. The results were meticulously recorded in journals and reports that were later sent to military headquarters in Tokyo. Women prisoners faced their own nightmare. Many were infected with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases to study the progression and transmission. Some were forcibly impregnated and then dissected to examine fetal development under disease conditions. Pregnant women infected with plague or typhoid were cut open so doctors could observe how the infection affected the fetus. These experiments had no scientific value. They were acts of pure cruelty disguised as research. By 1943, Unit 731 had become one of the largest and most well-funded military research programs in the Japanese Empire. Over 3,000 people worked at the Harbin facility alone. The annual budget exceeded that of many army divisions. And yet, despite the scale of the operation, the world knew almost nothing about it. The Japanese military classified everything. Foreign journalists were barred from Manchuria. Prisoners were transported in secret. Even within Japan, most citizens had no idea what was happening in Harbin. And that secrecy would later allow many of the perpetrators to escape justice. But the crimes were too vast to be hidden forever. As the war dragged on, rumors began to spread. Chinese resistance fighters reported strange diseases appearing after Japanese attacks. Soviet intelligence gathered reports from defectors and prisoners of war. And inside Unit 731, some staff members began to question what they were doing. A few tried to resist. Most stayed silent. Because in the machinery of war, silence is complicity. And at Unit 731, complicity meant becoming part of the greatest medical atrocity of the 20th century.
By 1945, Japan was losing the war. American bombers were pounding Tokyo. Soviet forces were massing on the Manchurian border. And inside Unit 731, General Ishii knew that the end was near. But he was not preparing to surrender. He was preparing to destroy all evidence. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. Within days, Soviet tanks were racing toward Harbin. Ishii received orders from Tokyo to evacuate Unit 731 immediately and erase all traces of the facility. What followed was one of the most systematic cover-ups in history. First, Ishii ordered the execution of all remaining prisoners. Over 400 Maruta were still alive in the compound. They were taken to the crematorium, shot and burned. Some were killed with poison gas. Others were injected with cyanide. Not a single prisoner was allowed to survive. Next, Ishii ordered the destruction of all buildings and equipment. Explosives were planted throughout the compound. Laboratories were set on fire. Documents were burned. Medical equipment was smashed. The goal was to leave nothing behind that could prove what had happened. But Ishii made sure to preserve the most important research. Thousands of pages of data, including photographs, autopsy reports, and experimental results, were packed into crates and shipped back to Japan. These documents represented years of human experimentation, and Ishii believed they were too valuable to destroy. Finally, on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender, Ishii and his senior staff evacuated Harbin by train. They traveled south to Korea and then by ship to Japan. By the time Soviet forces reached the Unit 731 compound on August 19th, the facility was a smoking ruin. The Soviets found mass graves, fragments of medical equipment, and half-destroyed buildings, but they found no survivors, no complete records, and no Japanese staff. The cover-up had succeeded. Or so it seemed. When the war ended, Japan was occupied by American forces under General Douglas MacArthur. The United States wanted to prosecute Japanese war criminals, just as it had done with Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials. But when American intelligence learned about Unit 731, something unexpected happened. Instead of arresting Ishii and his team, the United States offered them immunity in exchange for their research data. The reason was simple. The Cold War was beginning. The United States was locked in a global struggle with the Soviet Union, and biological warfare was seen as a strategic weapon.
American military scientists wanted access to the data from Unit 731, data that had been obtained through experiments that no ethical researcher in the West could ever conduct. In 1946, American investigators met with General Ishii in Tokyo. They offered him a deal. If he handed over all the research from Unit 731 and agreed to cooperate with American biological warfare programs, he and his staff would not be prosecuted. Ishii agreed. The deal was kept secret for decades. While Nazi doctors were hanged at Nuremberg for conducting human experiments, the doctors of Unit 731 walked free. Some returned to civilian life and became university professors, hospital directors, and successful businessmen. Ishii himself was never charged with any crime. He died in 1959 of throat cancer, living comfortably in Tokyo until the end. The data from Unit 731 was classified and stored in American military archives. It included detailed reports on plague, anthrax, frostbite, and human vivisection. Whether this data was ever used by the United States remains a subject of debate, but documents declassified in the 1980s show that American scientists did study the Unit 731 research extensively. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union conducted its own war crimes trial. In December 1949, the Khabarovsk war crime trials were held in the Soviet Far East. 12 members of Unit 731 who had been captured by Soviet forces were put on trial. They confessed to conducting human experiments and biological warfare attacks. All were found guilty and sentenced to labor camps. But this trial was largely ignored by the West, dismissed as Soviet propaganda during the height of the Cold War. As a result, most of the world remained unaware of Unit 731 for decades. In Japan, the subject was taboo. Textbooks did not mention it. Survivors were afraid to speak, and the government refused to acknowledge that the atrocities had ever taken place. It was not until the 1980s that Japanese journalists and historians began to investigate. One of the key figures in exposing Unit 731 was Morimura Seiichi, a Japanese author who published a book called The Devil's Gluttony in 1981. The book was based on interviews with former Unit 731 staff and Chinese survivors. It shocked Japanese society and sparked a national debate. In the years that followed, more evidence emerged.
Chinese archaeologists excavated mass graves near Harbin and found human remains with signs of surgical dissection and disease. Japanese researchers uncovered classified documents in government archives, and former staff members, now elderly and facing death, began to confess. But even today, the Japanese government has never issued a formal apology for Unit 731. The atrocities are mentioned briefly in some textbooks, but many right-wing politicians continue to deny or downplay what happened. And, unlike Germany, which has taken full responsibility for the Holocaust, Japan remains deeply divided over how to remember its wartime past. The legacy of Unit 731 is not just about the past, it is about accountability. It is about how societies choose to confront their own history and what happens when they do not.
Today, the site of Unit 731 in Harbin has been turned into a museum. It is officially called the Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731, and it stands as one of the most important historical sites in China. The museum displays surgical tools, photographs, preserved specimens, and testimonies from survivors and former staff. Every year, thousands of visitors walk through the ruins of the compound, trying to comprehend the scale of what happened there. But the museum is more than a memorial. It is a reminder of how easily humanity can abandon its moral boundaries. The experiments at Unit 731 were not conducted by monsters. They were conducted by educated doctors, trained scientists, and ordinary soldiers who believed they were serving their country. Many of them had families. Many of them attended church. Many of them, after the war, returned to normal lives. And that is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of Unit 731, that ordinary people, under the right conditions, are capable of extraordinary evil. The question we must ask ourselves is not how could this happen, but how can we prevent it from happening again? The answer begins with memory. One of the most important efforts to preserve the memory of Unit 731 has come from Chinese survivors and their families. For decades, they have fought to have their stories heard, to demand justice, and to ensure that the world does not forget. In 1997, a group of Chinese survivors filed a lawsuit in Tokyo District Court demanding compensation and an official apology from the Japanese government. The case was eventually dismissed, but it brought international attention to the issue and forced Japan to confront its past. In 2002, the Tokyo High Court acknowledged that Unit 731 had conducted biological warfare experiments and killed thousands of people, but it ruled that the survivors were not entitled to compensation under Japanese law. The ruling was a bitter disappointment, but it marked the first time that a Japanese court had officially recognized the existence and crimes of Unit 731. In the years since, more evidence has come to light. In 2011, Japanese researchers discovered over 100 human bones buried near the site of Unit 731. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bones belonged to Chinese prisoners who had been subjected to experiments. In 2018, Japan's National Archives released thousands of previously classified documents related to Unit 731, including personnel records and budget reports. These documents confirmed that Unit 731 was not a rogue operation, but a fully authorized military program with support from the highest levels of government. Yet even with this evidence, many questions remain unanswered. How many people were killed at Unit 731? The commonly cited figure is 10,000, but some historians believe the true number could be much higher, possibly exceeding 200,000 when field experiments and biological warfare attacks are included. What happened to all the research data? Some of it was handed over to the United States, some was seized by the Soviet Union, and some was destroyed.
but it is likely that much of it still exists in classified archives around the world. And why did so many perpetrators escape justice? The answer is that politics and power often take precedence over morality. The United States chose to protect Ishii and his staff because it wanted their research. Japan chose to remain silent because acknowledging the crimes would have been politically inconvenient.
And the international community, focused on the Cold War, chose to look the other way. The legacy of Unit 731 extends far beyond World War II. It raises fundamental questions about medical ethics, human rights, and the limits of scientific research. In the decades since the war, the Nuremberg Code and the Geneva Conventions have established international standards for ethical research and the treatment of prisoners. But these laws exist only because of atrocities like Unit 731. They are a reminder that progress often comes at the cost of suffering and that vigilance is the price of humanity. Today, as new technologies like genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and bioweapons research advance at a rapid pace, the lessons of Unit 731 are more relevant than ever. We live in a world where science can cure disease or create it, where technology can save lives or destroy them. And the only thing standing between progress and atrocity is our collective commitment to ethical principles. That is why we must remember Unit 731, not to dwell on the past, but to learn from it, not to assign blame, but to take responsibility, not to create division, but to build a future where such crimes can never happen again. The prisoners of Unit 731 did not die in vain if their suffering teaches us the true cost of dehumanization. The victims are gone, but their voices remain in the archives, in the museums, and in the memories of those who refuse to forget. As a society, we have a choice. We can turn away from uncomfortable truths, or we can face them with courage and honesty. We can allow history to be buried, or we can preserve it for future generations. We can repeat the mistakes of the past, or we can learn from them. The choice is ours. But one thing is certain. The history of Unit 731 must never be forgotten, because in the darkest chapters of human history, we find the most important lessons about who we are, what we are capable of, and what we must never allow ourselves to become.